A Tudor wife did not always lose her place through scandal, betrayal, or divorce. Sometimes, she simply disappeared while still living in the same house. Guests continued to visit. Servants continued their work. And the marriage itself appeared perfectly intact. Yet slowly, almost politely, the center of the household moved away from her. Conversations changed direction. Loyalties shifted. And another presence began to occupy the spaces where influence once lived. Nothing was announced. Nothing was confessed. And no one openly admitted what was happening. Tonight, we step quietly into a Tudor household to watch how a wife could fade from power without a single word of war. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to attend a noble wedding in Tudor England, the atmosphere might appear grand and joyful. Yet beneath the music and candlelight lay a calculation far more serious than romance. Guests gathered in stone halls, decorated with tapestries. Servants hurried between long tables carrying wine and roasted meats. And musicians filled the air with festive sounds. To the outside eye, the event looked like a celebration of love. In truth, it was something closer to a carefully arranged agreement between families whose fortunes depended on one another. Among the English nobility, marriage was rarely the result of personal affection. Instead, it functioned as a mechanism through which land, wealth, and influence could be secured for another generation. Families studied potential alliances with the same seriousness that merchants applied to contracts. A daughter represented an opportunity to strengthen political ties, while a son represented the continuation of a lineage that might have taken centuries to build. For this reason, negotiations often began long before the couple themselves had any say in the matter. Fathers discussed dowries, estates, and inheritance rights across heavy wooden tables, while clerks recorded the details on parchment. What mattered most was not compatibility between the bride and groom, but compatibility between the fortunes of their two families. Land was at the center of these decisions. In Tudor society, land meant power. The more acreage a family controlled, the greater its political influence and financial security. Marriage provided a reliable way to combine estates or prevent them from slipping into rival hands. A union between two houses could stabilize borders, settle disputes, or expand the reach of a powerful family into new territories. Bloodlines carried equal importance. Noble families believed their lineage connected them to centuries of tradition and authority. A marriage, therefore, had to protect that lineage from dilution or scandal. The bride's ancestry was examined carefully, her relatives discussed in private conversations, and her reputation was weighed alongside the wealth she brought with her. Love, when it existed, was considered a fortunate bonus rather than a requirement. In many cases, the couple met only a handful of times before the wedding took place. Their expectations were shaped less by emotion and more by duty. The husband understood that he was securing alliances and producing heirs. The wife understood that she was entering a household where her role would help maintain the honor of two families at once. This understanding did not necessarily mean that marriages were unhappy. Over time, familiarity and shared responsibilities could lead to companionship. Some couples developed mutual respect after years of managing estates and raising children together. Yet even in such cases, affection remained secondary to the larger responsibilities that marriage carried. Honor stood above personal feeling in the hierarchy of Tudor values. A noble household could survive a cold marriage, but it could not survive public disgrace. Reputation shaped how families were received at court, how alliances were negotiated, and how future marriages were arranged for their children. Because of this, appearances mattered enormously. A husband and wife were expected to present a united front to the outside world. They attended church together, welcomed visiting nobles into their halls, and oversaw ceremonies that reinforced their social standing. Their relationship symbolized the stability of the entire household. Behind closed doors, emotions might vary widely. Some couples lived peacefully, while others existed in polite distance. But personal happiness was rarely allowed to disrupt the structure that marriage was designed to protect. The wife, in particular, carried the visible burden of preserving family dignity. She supervised servants, organized the household's daily operations, and ensured that guests encountered an environment of discipline and refinement. Her conduct reflected directly on the reputation of her husband and the lineage she had joined. In this sense, she functioned as both caretaker and symbol. Her presence at the center of the household reassured the world that the family remained orderly and respectable, even when affection between husband and wife was limited. The marriage itself remained a public pillar, supporting the household's legitimacy. Yet this structure contained a quiet vulnerability, because marriage emphasized duty over personal attachment. Emotional distance could easily develop within the relationship. The husband's life often carried him beyond the walls of the estate into politics, courtly obligations, and travel. The wife remained responsible for the domestic world of the household, managing servants and overseeing the upbringing of children. Their lives intersected in ceremony and responsibility, but not always in intimacy. This separation created a space where other relationships could emerge without immediately threatening the official structure of marriage. Tudor society did not openly encourage such relationships, yet it often tolerated them as long as they remained discreet and did not interfere with inheritance. Thus, within households built on alliances rather than affection, private attachments sometimes formed quietly alongside the formal marriage. The official union remained intact, supported by law, property, and family honor. Yet emotional attention could begin to drift elsewhere in ways that were difficult to detect from the outside. From a distance, the household still appeared stable. The marriage contract remained valid. The family reputation remained intact. The estate continued to function exactly as it had before. But within the quiet rhythms of noble life, the absence of affection could slowly create a different kind of imbalance. One that would not reveal itself immediately, yet would eventually reshape the relationships inside the house. A Tudor marriage was designed to secure land, lineage, and honor, yet the very structure that protected these things could also leave room for emotional loyalties that existed outside the official union. Marriage in Tudor England was built to preserve property, a lineage, and family honor rather than personal affection. Yet a household founded on duty often contained quiet spaces where emotional distance could grow, and when that distance widened far enough, another presence sometimes stepped into the silence. The position of a wife in a Tudor noble household appeared firm and unquestioned when viewed from the outside. Marriage was recognized by the church as a sacred bond, and the law treated the wife as the legitimate partner of the household's master. At ceremonies, religious services, and public gatherings, she stood beside her husband as the visible confirmation that the family line remained secure and respectable. Within Tudor society, legitimacy carried enormous weight. A marriage conducted under the authority of the church created a structure that few dared to challenge openly. Once the vows had been spoken and witnessed, the union was expected to endure for life. Separation was rare, and divorce required complex legal arguments that most noble families preferred to avoid. Stability mattered far more than personal happiness. Because of this, the wife held a position that seemed protected by powerful institutions. The church recognized her marriage. The law acknowledged her status. Society accepted her as the rightful lady of the house. Inside the manor, her presence shaped the daily rhythm of the household. She oversaw servants, directed the preparation of meals, and ensured that the estate functioned with the discipline expected of a noble residence. When guests arrived, it was often the wife who greeted them first, presenting the calm authority that reflected well on the family. Her influence extended particularly into the upbringing of children. Sons and daughters were raised under her supervision during their earliest years. Tutors might be hired and servants assigned to assist, but the mother remained responsible for shaping their manners, education, and behavior. In the eyes of the household, she represented the continuity of the family's future. For a noblewoman who produced sons, this role carried even greater importance. A son ensured the survival of the lineage, and the mother of that heir gained a certain quiet respect within the family structure. Her position could appear nearly unassailable. The children linked her permanently to the estate, and the legitimacy of those children reinforced her place within the household. Yet the strength of this position was not as solid as it first appeared. Despite her recognized status, the legal framework of Tudor society placed ultimate authority in the hands of the husband. The property belonged to him. Political influence flowed through his connections, and the estate itself operated under his name. Even the wealth that accompanied the wife's dowry often passed into his control after the marriage. The wife managed the household, but she did not control its foundation. This imbalance created a quiet dependence that shaped the nature of her authority. Her influence functioned smoothly when the husband supported her position and treated her role with respect. Under those circumstances, she could exercise considerable control over domestic life and maintain strong relationships with other noble families. But if that support weakened, the stability of her role could begin to shift. The law might still recognize her marriage, yet the daily decisions that guided the household could start to move in directions she did not control. Invitations to certain gatherings might be handled privately by her husband. Financial matters might be discussed without her presence. The network of influence that once passed through her hands could slowly begin to bypass her. None of these changes required a formal announcement. From the outside, the household still appeared perfectly normal. The wife still carried her title. She still sat beside her husband at public events. Visitors entering the manor saw the same structure they had always known. Yet authority inside a household did not always depend on visible roles. It often rested on attention, trust, and private conversations that took place beyond the view of guests and servants. If the husband chose to share those conversations elsewhere, the wife's influence could quietly diminish without any public challenge to her position. This possibility created a fragile balance within Tudor marriages. A wife possessed legitimacy, respectability, and the protection of the church. But the practical strength of her role depended heavily on the personal decisions of the man who held legal authority over the estate. In other words, her position was both recognized and vulnerable at the same time. She could appear secure while standing beside her husband in the great hall. Yet the foundation of that security relied on something far less stable than law or ceremony. It relied on the husband's continued willingness to keep her at the center of the household. When that willingness remained strong, the wife's authority could endure for decades. She governed domestic life, guided the upbringing of children, and preserved the dignity of the family name. But if the husband's attention began to drift elsewhere, the carefully balanced structure supporting her role could start to tilt in ways that few people noticed at first. A wife might still hold the title. She might still command respect from servants. She might still appear beside her husband at every formal occasion. Yet within the quiet spaces of the household, something essential could already be changing. The Tudor wife possessed legitimacy, social respect, and the protection of the church. Yet those protections depended heavily on the goodwill of the husband who controlled the household's authority. And once that goodwill began to weaken, the strength of her position could quietly begin to fade. In many Tudor households, the official structure of marriage could remain intact, while another relationship quietly formed within the same walls. Such relationships rarely appeared in formal records or public ceremonies. They existed instead in the private corners of estates. in conversations held behind closed doors, and in moments of companionship that unfolded far from the eyes of visiting guests. The woman who occupied this hidden position possessed no legal title within the household. She was not recognized by the church as part of the marriage. She held no claim to the estate's inheritance. Her name did not appear beside the husband's in public rituals. Yet despite this absence of formal recognition, the presence of a mistress could gradually carry a different kind of influence, one rooted not in law but in proximity. Unlike the wife, whose role was shaped by duty and ceremony, the mistress often existed within the husband's private world. Their conversations did not revolve around estate accounts or the expectations of noble families. Instead, they unfolded in moments where the rigid structure of marriage temporarily disappeared. This difference created a contrast that Tudor society quietly understood but rarely discussed openly. The wife represented stability. The mistress represented intimacy. Within the formal order of the household, the wife remained the visible center of legitimacy. She hosted guests, supervised servants, and upheld the reputation of the family. The mistress, by contrast, existed in the background, rarely acknowledged publicly, but often occupying the emotional space that marriage sometimes failed to fill. Large estates made such arrangements easier to maintain. Tudor manors often contained dozens of rooms, separate wings, and private chambers that allowed different lives to unfold under the same roof. Servants moved constantly through corridors and stairways, carrying messages, food, and letters between parts of the house that rarely intersected. Within this environment, a discrete relationship could remain hidden for long periods. At first, the mistress held a fragile position, without legal recognition. Her presence depended entirely on the continued attention of the man who favored her. She possessed neither property nor social protection within the household. If that attention disappeared, her connection to the estate could vanish almost immediately. Yet proximity created its own form of power. The mistress often shared moments with the husband that no one else could observe. Conversations, late at night, confidences spoken in private rooms, and emotional support during periods of political stress could slowly deepen the connection between them. Over time, these interactions sometimes created a bond that carried influence beyond personal companionship. The husband might begin to seek her opinion in matters that extended beyond private life. At first, these discussions remained small and informal. A political rumor, a dispute between neighboring families, or a concern about events at court might be mentioned in a passing conversation. The mistress, free from the formal obligations placed upon the wife, could respond with a perspective that felt less constrained by duty. In this way, emotional closeness sometimes translates into quiet influence. A suggestion offered in private might later shape a decision made in public. A concern raised during a conversation might alter how the husband approaches a negotiation or alliance. None of this appeared openly connected to the mistress. Yet the chain of influence could exist nonetheless. The wife, meanwhile, continued to fulfill her official responsibilities within the household. She remained the lawful partner, the mother of legitimate heirs, and the public symbol of family stability. Visitors still greeted her as the lady of the manor, and her authority over domestic affairs remained visible to everyone within the estate. From the outside, the household appeared unchanged, but influence rarely moved only through formal titles. Within Tudor society, emotional loyalty could gradually shift the direction of private decision-making. A husband who trusted the companionship of a mistress might begin to rely on her counsel during moments of uncertainty. These private exchanges rarely appeared in letters or records, yet they could shape the atmosphere inside the household in subtle ways. The mistress did not replace the wife in the legal structure of the family. That position remained protected by tradition, religion, and inheritance law. But the emotional center of the husband's attention could begin to move toward the person who occupied his private world rather than his public one. At first, The difference might seem small. The wife continued to host gatherings and maintain the dignity of the estate. The mistress remained unseen by most visitors. Servants might notice quiet patterns of movement within the house, but they spoke of them only in whispers. Yet over time, such arrangements could reshape the balance within the household. A mistress without a title might still influence the thoughts of the man who held authority. A conversation held in private might guide decisions made in public. And attention, once redirected, rarely returned entirely to its original place. This quiet transformation often unfolded slowly, unnoticed by those who only observed the formal structure of the marriage. The wife still occupied her rightful position. The marriage still stood under the protection of the church. The estate continued to operate as it always had. Yet within the private world of the household, a new presence had begun to shape the currents of influence that moved beneath the surface. A mistress in Tudor society possessed no legal title, no inheritance rights, and no formal place within the household. Yet emotional closeness sometimes granted her a quiet influence that law could not control. Once private companionship begins to guide the thoughts of the man who holds authority, the balance of an entire household can start to shift in ways no one openly admits. A Tudor manor could contain dozens of rooms, thick stone walls, and corridors long enough to conceal many private lives at once. From the outside, such estates appeared orderly and disciplined. Their routines governed by tradition and hierarchy. Servants moved quietly through halls. Meals were served at predictable hours, and the household seemed to operate according to rules that had remained unchanged for generations. Within that structure, however, relationships could become far more complicated than the orderly routines suggested. When a mistress became a regular presence in the life of a married nobleman, the household entered a delicate balance that few people acknowledged openly. The wife still held the official position beside her husband. She oversaw the servants, managed the domestic rhythm of the estate, and appeared with dignity whenever visitors arrived. The marriage itself remained visible, intact, and publicly unquestioned. Yet, somewhere within the same walls, another relationship existed quietly beside it. Large estates made such arrangements easier to maintain. Separate wings, private chambers, and guest apartments allowed individuals to occupy the same building while living largely separate daily lives. A nobleman might spend part of the evening in the great hall beside his wife, attending to guests and maintaining the appearance of stability. Later, when the household settled into silence, he might disappear into another part of the manor where fewer eyes followed him. No announcements marked this change. Servants rarely spoke about what they observed. In noble households, silence was part of the discipline expected from those who worked within the estate. A footman might notice that the master's footsteps turned down a different corridor each night. A maid might observe that certain rooms required preparation more often than others. These details accumulated quietly, understood by those who lived within the house, but rarely discussed aloud. The wife often sensed these changes, long before anyone mentioned them. She knew the rhythms of the household better than anyone. She recognized when her husband's routines shifted, when conversations shortened, or when the distance between them became more than a matter of busy schedules. Yet Tudor society offered few tools for addressing such situations openly. A wife could not easily confront the presence of a mistress without risking scandal. Public accusations threatened the reputation of the family, even if the wife spoke the truth. The act of exposing conflict within the marriage could damage the dignity that noble households worked carefully to preserve. For this reason, many such tensions remained unspoken. Life within the manor continued according to its familiar routines. Morning prayers were held in the chapel. Meals were served in the great hall. Guests were welcomed with the same courteous ceremonies. To those who entered the house from the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But beneath these ordinary patterns, the emotional landscape of the household could begin to change. The husband moved between two relationships that occupied different parts of his life. The wife maintained the public structure of the marriage. The mistress existed within the private spaces where formal expectations carried less weight. Each person understood their position in ways that were rarely discussed directly. The wife protected the dignity of the household. The mistress preserved the secrecy of her place. The husband balanced appearances against personal desire. Because none of them declared open conflict, the arrangement could persist for long periods. The absence of confrontation created the illusion that the household remained stable, yet silence did not prevent change. Over time, attention and influence could shift quietly through the structure of the house. A conversation that once belonged to the wife might begin to occur elsewhere. Decisions that once involved her opinion might be discussed privately beyond her hearing. None of these moments alone appeared dramatic. Yet together, they altered the subtle balance of power within the household. Even the servants, trained to observe without speaking, could sense the shift. They noticed who received private messages from the master. They noticed which rooms remained lit late into the night. They noticed the quiet patterns that revealed where attention truly rested. Within a household where status depended heavily on perception, these small observations mattered. No one declared that the wife had lost her place. No one announced that the mistress held influence. But the rhythm of daily life began to reflect a different reality. The wife remained seated beside her husband at formal gatherings. Her authority within the household continued to exist in visible ways. Guests still addressed her as the lady of the manor, and servants still followed her instructions when managing domestic affairs. Yet the emotional center of the household no longer rested entirely where it once had. The presence of three people within the same structure created a quiet tension that did not require arguments to exist. Each understood that the balance of the household depended on maintaining appearances. No one wished to create a scandal that might damage the family's reputation. So the silence continued. And within that silence, the order of the household slowly rearranged itself. Three people could inhabit the same Tudor household without ever declaring open conflict. Silence preserved appearances, while the routines of the house continued unchanged. Beneath that calm surface, the structure of family authority had already begun to move in directions that no one openly acknowledged. During the early stage of such an arrangement, the household did not collapse into chaos. Instead, it entered a strange period of balance that appeared almost calm to anyone looking from the outside. The marriage remained intact. The mistress remained discreet, and the routines of the estate continued as they always had. Yet beneath this appearance of order, a quiet tension existed within the structure of daily life. The wife still occupied the official position within the household. She remained the lady of the manor, the figure responsible for maintaining the dignity of the estate. Servants answered to her instructions. Guests greeted her with respect, and her presence at formal events confirmed that the marriage continued to stand as the center of family life. At the long dining tables of the great hall, she sat beside her husband exactly as tradition required. Visitors saw nothing unusual in the arrangement. The rituals of noble life, church attendance, banquets, and seasonal celebrations continued without interruption. To those who arrived at the estate only occasionally, the household appeared stable. But stability in Tudor households often depended on appearances rather than emotional reality. While the wife preserved the public structure of the marriage, another relationship existed quietly beyond the boundaries of ceremony. The mistress did not take part in official gatherings, yet she occupied the private world of the husband's attention. In the evenings, after the formal duties of the household were complete, the rhythms of the manor changed. Guests retired to their chambers. Servants extinguished candles in the hallways. The great rooms of the house slowly fell into silence. It was during these quiet hours that the separation between two worlds became most visible. The husband moved between them. By day, he fulfilled the expectations placed upon him as a nobleman and a husband. He attended meetings, welcomed visitors, and maintained the outward image of a stable household. His wife remained beside him during these public moments, representing the legitimacy of the marriage that bound their families together. By night, his path through the manor might lead elsewhere. The mistress often occupied a different part of the estate, perhaps a private chamber prepared under the explanation of extended hospitality or distant kinship. Her presence remained discreet, carefully hidden within the quiet geography of the house. Servants understood the boundaries of this arrangement without needing to speak of it. Certain corridors became active only late at night. Certain rooms required preparation at unexpected hours. Small signals passed silently through the household, understood by those who lived within its walls. No one announced the arrangement openly. The wife rarely addressed it directly. Confrontation risked exposing the delicate imbalance that everyone preferred to ignore. As long as the marriage remained publicly intact, silence preserved the dignity of the household. Yet silence did not erase the tension. The wife maintained her authority within the visible world of the estate. She directed the household, supervised servants, and ensured that guests encountered an atmosphere of discipline and refinement. Her position remained official, protected by law and tradition. But emotional attention, the quieter form of influence that moved through private conversations and shared confidences, increasingly flowed toward the mistress. This division created a household divided into two separate spheres. The wife governed the public order of the estate. The mistress occupied the private space of companionship. The husband moved between them, maintaining both worlds without allowing them to collide. For a time, the arrangement could appear sustainable. The wife still carried the title that defined the household. The mistress remained hidden from public acknowledgement. The husband preserved the appearance of balance, ensuring that no scandal disturbed the reputation of the family. Yet the existence of these two worlds required constant management. Every dinner, every gathering, every moment of shared space required careful attention to what was said and what remained unspoken. The wife understood that dignity demanded restraint. The mistress understood that survival required discretion. The husband understood that the stability of his household depended on keeping both relationships separate. Such arrangements did not explode into sudden conflict. They stretched quietly over time. The wife might notice subtle shifts in her husband's attention. Conversations once shared between them might become shorter and more formal. His presence within her rooms might grow less frequent, replaced by explanations of late work or private obligations. None of these changes alone seemed dramatic, yet together they formed a pattern that slowly altered the emotional structure of the household. Visitors entering the manor still saw a husband and wife seated together at the center of noble life. Servants still addressed the wife as their mistress. The estate continued to function according to traditions that had endured for generations. But beneath that orderly surface, the husband's loyalty had begun to divide. One world belonged to duty, the other belonged to desire. And in Tudor households, the coexistence of those two worlds rarely remained balanced forever. At first, the household maintained a fragile equilibrium, where duty and intimacy existed in separate spaces. The wife preserved the official order of the estate, while the mistress occupied the husband's private attention. Over time, the quiet division between those two worlds began to influence decisions that once belonged entirely to the marriage. In a Tudor household, where tension quietly existed between wife and mistress, open conflict rarely appeared at first. Noble families understood too well that public quarrels carried dangerous consequences. A scandal could travel quickly through court gossip, damaging alliances that had taken generations to build. For this reason, even when emotions ran deep within the walls of an estate, restraint became the safest response. The wife might recognize the shifting loyalties of her husband. She might see how his attention moved elsewhere, how private conversations became shorter, and how distance slowly replaced the familiarity that had once existed between them. Yet, Tudor society offered few advantages to a woman who chose to expose such tensions publicly. To accuse her husband openly would risk humiliating the family name. Noble households existed under constant observation from neighbouring families, political rivals, and members of the royal court. Reputation shaped everything, from invitations to alliances to the future marriages of children. A public dispute between husband and wife could easily become a subject of whispered conversations far beyond the walls of the manor. Because of this, many women adopted a different approach. Instead of confrontation, they chose silence. Silence did not mean ignorance. It meant control. By refusing to turn private tension into public scandal, the wife protected the dignity of the household she represented. Guests continued to arrive at the manor and see the same orderly structure they had always known. Banquets were hosted with the same careful elegance. Religious ceremonies and seasonal celebrations unfolded exactly as tradition required. The appearance of stability remained intact, within that carefully maintained image. However, emotional distance began to replace the earlier attempts at confrontation. The wife no longer demanded explanations. The husband no longer offered them. Conversations that might once have erupted into arguments simply disappeared. In their place came a colder form of coexistence. The couple continued to share the same estate, yet the emotional bond between them gradually withdrew into formality. Their interactions became polite, measured, and carefully limited to the responsibilities that required cooperation. They spoke about estate matters. They discussed the education of children. They greeted guests together when necessary. Beyond these duties, their lives moved increasingly along separate paths. This transformation, from conflict to distance, served an important purpose. By avoiding dramatic confrontations, the household preserved its public reputation. No servants reported shouting in the corridors. No guests witnessed humiliating arguments in the Great Hall. Everything appeared calm, yet calmness often concealed something far more complex. Silence allowed the husband to maintain both relationships without forcing a public choice between them. The wife retained her formal authority, continuing to oversee the household and uphold the dignity expected of her position. The mistress remained within the private world of the husband's attention, protected by the absence of open accusations. For a time, this arrangement appeared stable, but silence also carried a quiet cost. The emotional life of the marriage gradually faded into something colder and more distant. The wife's dignity required composure, yet that composure created a barrier that neither partner attempted to cross. Their relationship settled into a pattern where duty replaced intimacy entirely. In the eyes of the household, they remained husband and wife. Within their private lives, they had become something closer to political partners, maintaining a shared institution. The servants, who observed more than anyone else, sensed this change long before it became obvious. They noticed how rarely the master entered his wife's chambers. They noticed how conversations between the couple became shorter and more formal. Yet the discipline of noble households discouraged commentary. Servants understood that silence protected not only their employers, but also their own positions within the estate. Thus, the household continued its routines. Guests still praised the order of the manor. Neighbours still respected the stability of the marriage. The family name remained untouched by scandal. But the tension that once threatened to erupt into confrontation had not disappeared. It had merely changed form. Instead of arguments, there was distance. Instead of accusations, there was restraint. Instead of passion, there was careful composure. In Tudor society, such silence often proved more powerful than open conflict. It allowed the household to preserve its reputation while quietly transforming the emotional structure that once held the marriage together. The wife no longer fought for attention. The husband no longer pretended that affection remained unchanged. Between them grew a calm that was not peace, but something colder. A quiet understanding settled into the rhythm of the house. Appearances must remain perfect, even if the marriage itself had already begun to drift apart. Open conflict threatened the reputation of a noble household. So many Tudor couples replaced confrontation with silence. The marriage continued to function publicly while emotional distance grew quietly within the estate. That silence, however, created the conditions for another arrangement to form beneath the surface. In many Tudor households, where a mistress had become a quiet but constant presence, a peculiar understanding sometimes developed between the husband and the woman who occupied his private attention. It was rarely spoken aloud and rarely recorded in letters or documents. Yet, its existence could shape the rhythm of the household in ways that were felt by everyone who lived within the estate. This understanding rested on restraint. Neither the husband nor the mistress had an interest in provoking open scandal. A public conflict with the wife would risk damaging the family name, attracting attention from the court, and creating legal complications that could threaten property and inheritance. Tudor society tolerated discreet relationships more easily than dramatic upheavals. Because of this, the mistress rarely demanded immediate recognition. She understood that her position depended entirely on the continued favor of the man whose attention she held. Without legal status, she had little protection against the consequences of public controversy. If the household fell into scandal, it would almost certainly be the mistress who suffered the most severe social consequences. For the husband, the situation required equal caution. His marriage remained the legal foundation of the estate. The wife represented the legitimacy of the household and the secure inheritance of his children. Any attempt to remove her openly would invite scrutiny from relatives, clergy, and possibly even the royal court. Divorce during the Tudor period was extraordinarily difficult to obtain. It required extensive legal argument and often depended on proving circumstances that families preferred to keep hidden. Even when separation was possible, the damage to reputation could be lasting. For these reasons, neither the husband nor the mistress typically pushed for immediate change. Instead, a quieter strategy sometimes emerged. The wife would remain in her formal position within the household. Her title, authority over domestic matters, and public presence beside her husband would continue exactly as before. Guests would see the same stable marriage they had always known. Meanwhile, the private relationship between the husband and the mistress would deepen beyond the view of formal society. This arrangement created a delicate balance that both parties understood without needing to discuss it openly. The mistress did not attempt to replace the wife directly. The husband did not openly challenge the legitimacy of his marriage. Instead, they waited. Time itself became part of the strategy. Positions within Tudor households could weaken slowly without any formal declaration. A wife's influence might diminish as her husband relied less on her counsel. Her presence at certain gatherings might become less frequent. Decisions that once involved her opinion might begin to occur elsewhere. None of these changes required confrontation. The household continued to operate exactly as before. The wife still hosted guests and supervised the estate. The husband still appeared beside her at formal occasions. The mistress remained invisible to outsiders, yet increasingly central within the husband's private world. In this way, the arrangement functioned almost like a silent agreement. The mistress accepted that she would not immediately replace the wife. The husband accepted that the marriage must remain intact in public. Both understood that influence could shift gradually without provoking scandal. This patience often served their interests better than open rebellion against the structure of marriage. Within Tudor society, legitimacy carried enormous weight. A wife's legal status could not be easily removed, but it could be slowly overshadowed by quieter forms of influence. Emotional loyalty, shared confidences, and private companionship sometimes carried greater weight than the formal authority granted by law. The mistress did not need to defeat the wife directly. She only needed to remain present. Over time, the husband's reliance on that private companionship could reshape the household's internal dynamics. Conversations that once occurred with the wife might gradually move elsewhere. Decisions might be discussed privately before becoming official within the estate. From the outside, nothing had changed. The marriage still existed. The household still appeared stable. The wife still occupied her official place. Yet, the direction of influence within the household had begun to move quietly in another direction. Servants might notice the subtle changes long before anyone else. They observed which voices the master listened to most closely, which rooms remained occupied late into the evening, and which corridors carried footsteps after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. But discipline required silence. Thus, the quiet agreement continued to operate beneath the surface of noble life. No declarations were made. No confrontations announced. Instead, the balance of authority within the household slowly adjusted itself through patience and proximity. The wife retained her legal position. The mistress retained the husband's attention. The husband maintained both worlds without forcing them into open conflict. For a time, such arrangements could persist without disruption. Yet patience has its own consequences. When influence begins to shift slowly and quietly, the change can be difficult to recognize until the balance of power has already moved far from where it once stood. The husband and the mistress rarely attempted to overthrow the wife openly, understanding that scandal would threaten them both. Instead, they allowed the marriage to remain intact while private influence quietly expanded. Over time, that patience could alter the balance of the household more effectively than confrontation ever could. Within many Tudor households, the most important changes rarely arrived with dramatic gestures. No one gathered the family to announce a new order. No document declared that authority had shifted from one person to another. Instead, the balance inside the house often changed slowly, through habits so subtle that they almost escaped notice. The wife still held the same title she had always carried. Her name remained written beside her husband's in church records. Her seat at the dining table remained unchanged. Visitors entering the manor continued to greet her with formal respect. Nothing in the structure of the marriage appeared different. Yet influence inside a household did not always follow the same rules as law and ceremony. Titles could remain intact, even while attention quietly moved elsewhere. In Tudor society, where reputation mattered deeply, the absence of open conflict often allowed change to unfold in silence. At first, the signs were small enough to ignore. A conversation that once began with the wife might now take place privately before she arrived. A decision about travel, guests, or finances might reach her ears only after it had already been settled. Her husband still spoke to her politely, yet the tone of those conversations slowly lost the warmth that once connected them. No accusation explained this shift. No argument marked the beginning of it. Instead, the household drifted into a new rhythm that no one openly described. Servants noticed it first, though they would never have spoken about it openly. In noble houses, servants observed everything but commented on nothing. Their survival depended on silence and careful attention to the flow of authority within the estate. They noticed which instructions the master repeated most often. They noticed which corridors carried footsteps late into the evening. They noticed which doors closed quietly after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. Over time, these patterns revealed where influence truly rested. The wife still directed the domestic order of the household. She supervised meals, organized the work of servants, and ensured that guests encountered the discipline expected from a noble estate. Her presence remained visible in every formal aspect of household life. Yet decisions that once involved her opinion began to move along different paths. The husband no longer turned to her first when discussing matters that extended beyond routine duties. Conversations that might once have unfolded between them now took place elsewhere, in rooms that rarely appeared in the official structure of the household. None of this required a declaration. The mistress remained unseen by visitors and unrecognized by law. She possessed no formal authority over the estate. Yet proximity to the husband allowed her presence to shape moments where private influence mattered more than public status. Slowly, attention began to follow those private moments. The wife remained the legal center of the household, But emotional loyalty had begun to move elsewhere. At first, the difference appeared almost invisible. Guests continued to see the same stable marriage they had always known. The husband and wife still appeared together at church, still welcomed visitors into the great hall, and still represented the dignity of their family before the world. Yet the structure beneath that appearance had begun to shift. Influence within a Tudor household often moved through signals that outsiders rarely noticed. A servant might choose which instructions to follow first. A visitor might request a private conversation with the person believed to hold the master's confidence. Over time, these small signals formed a pattern that quietly revealed where authority truly lived. The wife's title did not disappear. Her position remained officially untouched. Yet the center of the household no longer revolved around her in the same way it once had. Without accusation, without confrontation, her presence gradually became less central to the decisions that shaped the estate. The husband still respected her role, yet his reliance on her counsel weakened little by little. This change happened slowly enough that no single moment could be blamed. No argument shattered the marriage. No scandal forced the household to choose sides. There was only time, quietly rearranging the balance of influence. Even the wife herself might struggle to identify the exact point when her authority began to fade. The routines of the house continued as always. Guests still arrived. Meals were still served, and servants still moved through the corridors with the same discipline they had always shown. But the rhythm of attention had changed. Where once the wife stood at the center of the household's emotional life, she now found herself standing slightly further from it. The shift was small at first, almost invisible, yet its consequences spread slowly through every corner of the estate. No one had pushed her aside. No one had declared her position weakened. Yet the place she once held within the household had quietly begun to slip away. The marriage still existed. The household still appeared stable. The title of wife still carried its legal authority. But influence had moved. And once attention settles somewhere else, it rarely returns to its original place unchanged. No accusation had been spoken, and no scandal had erupted to explain the change. The household continued its routines, while influence quietly moved away from the wife's reach. In Tudor houses, a woman could lose the center of power even when no one openly tried to take it from her. Isolation rarely began with harsh commands or open humiliation. In Tudor households, reputation mattered too much for such crude methods. A noble wife could not simply be dismissed or publicly replaced without risking scandal. Instead, the process often started in ways that appeared almost ordinary. The wife still lived within the same manor. She still carried the same title. She still occupied the chambers that belonged to her position. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet the rhythm of public life inside the estate began to move around her rather than through her. The great hall had always been the social heart of a Tudor household. It was where meals were served, guests welcomed, and alliances quietly reinforced through conversation and ceremony. When visitors arrived, the lady of the house normally stood beside her husband, greeting them with calm authority. Her presence reassured everyone that the household remained orderly and united. Gradually, that presence began to appear less frequently. At first, the absence seemed accidental. The wife might not attend a dinner because she was said to be resting or occupied with other duties. Guests might be welcomed by another member of the household instead. Perhaps a sister, a cousin, or a trusted female relative appeared beside the husband to perform the gestures that once belonged naturally to his wife. No explanation was necessary. Visitors rarely questioned such arrangements directly. Noble households often contained extended families, and it was not unusual for relatives to assist with hosting duties. A single evening without the wife did not attract suspicion, but the pattern slowly repeated itself. Another dinner passed without her presence. Another gathering took place, where she appeared only briefly. Another reception unfolded, where someone else stood beside the master of the house. The absence that once seemed temporary began to feel quietly permanent. This subtle withdrawal altered how guests understood the structure of the household. People who visited the estate began to direct their attention toward whoever occupied the space beside the husband during these social moments. Conversations formed around that person. Alliances were discussed with them, and influence slowly began to gather where visibility remained strongest. The wife still existed within the house, yet she was no longer the person most visitors encountered. Social life within Tudor society depended heavily on presence. Influence flowed through conversations held at tables, whispered exchanges in corridors, and the gestures of courtesy that defined noble gatherings. When someone appeared less often in those spaces, their voice gradually faded from the network of relationships that shaped the household's reputation. Isolation, therefore, worked quietly. The wife was not forbidden from attending gatherings. No one announced that she had been removed from her role. Instead, circumstances slowly made her presence less central to the social life of the estate. Another woman might stand beside the husband more often. Another voice might welcome guests first. Another presence might guide the rhythm of conversation during meals. Guests adapted quickly to these shifts. Visitors who arrived at the manor often followed the signals given by the household itself. If the wife appeared distant from the center of activity, they treated that distance as natural. If another woman seemed closer to the master of the house, they directed their attention toward her instead. No one wished to challenge the internal order of a noble household openly. Servants, too, learned to recognize the new pattern. They prepared certain seats more carefully than others. They carried messages through different corridors. They noticed which presence commanded the most attention during gatherings. Within the disciplined silence of a Tudor manor, such observations spread quietly, without ever becoming open discussion. For the wife, this transformation could feel both subtle and unmistakable. She still possessed her chambers, her title, and the formal respect owed to her position. Yet the spaces where influence once flowed naturally around her had begun to move elsewhere. The Great Hall, once the stage upon which she represented the dignity of the household, slowly became a place where she appeared less and less. This absence reshaped the social landscape of the house. A noblewoman's authority depended not only on law, but also on visibility. When guests, relatives, and allies no longer encountered her regularly at the center of social life, her influence weakened in ways that no legal decree could prevent. The change required no argument. No servant announced it. No visitor questioned it. The household simply adapted to a new arrangement in which the wife's presence had become less central than it once had been. Over time, this quiet isolation produced its own consequences. Relationships formed without her participation. Conversations unfolded in rooms where she was no longer expected to appear. Alliances that once depended on her presence began to grow elsewhere. The wife remained within the household, but the household itself had begun to move beyond her. The wife still held her title and continued to live within the walls of the manor. Yet her presence in the spaces where influence once gathered had slowly begun to fade. Tudor households often changed not through confrontation, but through a quiet absence that few people noticed until power had already moved elsewhere. Control inside a Tudor household did not rely only on titles or social visibility. It also rested quietly within ledgers, keys, and small wooden chests that held the wealth of the estate. Money, land rents, and household accounts formed the hidden machinery that kept noble life functioning smoothly. Whoever influenced these mechanisms possessed a power that rarely appeared in public ceremonies. The wife of a nobleman often participated in this system during the early years of marriage. She supervised household purchases, distributed wages to servants, and ensured that the daily expenses of the estate remained under careful control. Large manors required constant supplies: grain for bread, meat for the kitchens, candles for the halls, fabrics for clothing, and tools for the maintenance of buildings and land. Managing these resources demanded organization and authority. The wife frequently oversaw these responsibilities through stewards and senior servants. She might review household accounts, approve purchases for the kitchens, and authorize payments to workers who maintained the estate. In many households, the keys to storerooms and supply chests passed through her hands each day. From the outside, such duties appeared purely domestic, yet they carried quiet influence. A noble household functioned like a small community. Dozens of servants relied on wages and provisions that passed through the system she supervised. Decisions about supplies and spending affected the daily comfort of everyone living within the estate. For this reason, financial oversight strengthened the wife's authority within the household. When the balance of influence began to shift, this area often changed gradually as well. The transformation rarely happened through sudden commands. Instead, responsibilities slowly moved toward other figures within the estate's hierarchy. A steward might begin reporting more frequently to the husband rather than the wife. Certain accounts might be reviewed privately before reaching her desk. At first, these adjustments seemed minor. The wife might still oversee routine purchases for the household. Servants might still request approval for ordinary expenses. Yet larger decisions regarding property, rents, or long-term investments increasingly bypassed her involvement. The husband remained the legal owner of the estate, and Tudor law placed financial authority firmly in his hands. Because of this structure, shifting control required no official explanation. A husband could simply begin consulting other advisors, lawyers, relatives, or trusted servants, without openly removing his wife from her duties. Over time, the difference became noticeable. Keys that once passed through her chambers might now be kept elsewhere. Account books that once appeared on her writing table might arrive less frequently. Decisions regarding land rents or property transfers might occur beyond her hearing. None of these actions required confrontation. The wife still managed the visible routines of the household. She supervised servants, arranged meals, and ensured that guests encountered the order expected from a noble estate. Yet the deeper currents of financial control had begun to move away from her influence. Another method sometimes reinforced this shift. Property and wealth might gradually be directed toward future heirs or other family members. A son approaching adulthood might receive early control over portions of land. A trusted steward might gain greater responsibility over financial records. Even distant relatives might become involved in managing the estate's resources. Each change appeared practical and reasonable when considered individually, but together they reshaped the structure of authority within the household. The wife still possessed her title and her visible duties. However, the ability to influence long-term decisions about wealth and property slowly moved beyond her reach. In a society where land and money defined power, such changes quietly reduced her practical influence over the future of the estate. Servants observed these patterns with careful attention. They noticed who held the keys to the storerooms. They noticed whose instructions determined purchases. They noticed which signatures appeared most often in the household accounts. Within the silent hierarchy of the manor, these details revealed more about authority than any public ceremony ever could. The wife might not confront these changes directly. Confrontation carried the risk of exposing conflict within the marriage, something noble families avoided whenever possible. Instead, many women continued performing their duties with dignity while recognizing that the deeper mechanisms of power had begun to move elsewhere. The household still appeared stable to visitors. Meals continued to arrive on the table each evening. Servants continued their work with disciplined precision. The wife continued to represent the household with calm authority. Yet beneath these visible routines, the control of the estate's wealth gradually followed a different path. Money rarely moved suddenly. Property rarely changed hands overnight. Instead, financial authority shifted quietly through documents, decisions, and habits that altered the balance of influence within the house. The wife remained the lady of the manor, but the resources that sustained that manor increasingly answered to other voices. Financial authority often revealed the true direction of power within a Tudor household. The wife could still appear to manage the estate, while deeper control of wealth moved quietly beyond her reach. When influence over money began to shift, the structure of the household had already started to change. Power inside a Tudor household did not move only through property, titles, or formal authority. It also moved through stories. Quiet explanations repeated often enough that they slowly became accepted as truth. In noble families where reputation shaped every alliance and every future marriage, the way a household described itself to the outside world mattered enormously. When the balance within a marriage began to shift, the narrative surrounding that marriage often shifted as well. At first, the changes appeared harmless. A guest might hear a passing remark suggesting that the wife had been unwell recently. Someone might mention that she had become withdrawn or less interested in social gatherings. Another visitor might be told that she preferred the quiet of her chambers to the noise of the great hall. None of these comments sounded like accusations. They were offered gently, almost with sympathy. A relative might speak about the wife's delicate health. A servant might mention that she seemed tired after managing the estate for so many years. Such remarks created an impression that her absence from certain gatherings had natural and reasonable explanations. Over time, these explanations began to repeat themselves. Guests who visited the manor heard similar observations from different voices. The wife seemed quieter than before. She appeared less enthusiastic about hosting visitors. Perhaps the responsibilities of the household had worn down her spirit. Perhaps the strain of managing children and servants had left her fatigued. No one stated anything harsh, yet the effect slowly reshaped how others perceived her. In Tudor society, reputation was often built through subtle impressions rather than dramatic statements. When a particular description appeared repeatedly in conversations, it began to define how a person was understood within their community. The wife, who had once been seen as composed and dignified, might gradually be described as distant. The same calm demeanor that once reflected discipline could now be interpreted as coldness. Her quiet presence during gatherings might be seen not as restraint, but as indifference. Guests who noticed her absence from certain occasions might assume she had simply lost interest in the social life of the household. These interpretations spread quietly through networks of conversation. Meanwhile, another figure within the estate began to receive a different kind of description. The mistress, though rarely acknowledged publicly, might be spoken of in private terms that emphasized warmth and attentiveness. Someone might mention that she listened carefully during conversations. Another might remark that she seemed unusually understanding of the husband's concerns. Again, these comments rarely sounded deliberate. They appeared naturally within the flow of conversation. Visitors might say that she possessed a gentle temperament. Servants might remark that she spoke kindly to those around her. Gradually, a contrast formed between the two women within the household. One seemed distant and reserved. The other seemed warm and attentive. The contrast did not require anyone to openly criticize the wife. It existed within the way people spoke about everyday observations. A guest might simply comment that the mistress seemed easier to talk to. Another might remark that she brought a lighter atmosphere to the household. Each statement seemed harmless on its own. Yet together, they began to reshape the quiet narrative surrounding the family. Stories within noble households rarely remained contained within a single estate. Visitors carried impressions with them when they returned to neighboring manors or to the royal court. Conversations continued in other halls, gradually forming a broader understanding of how the household functioned. Through this process, the identity of each figure within the family slowly transformed. The wife remained the lawful partner of the husband, yet her public image grew colder in the eyes of others. The mistress remained unofficial, yet her reputation within private circles began to emphasize emotional intelligence and companionship. None of this required open confrontation. The wife might never hear the comments that shaped these perceptions. She might continue fulfilling her duties with the same dignity she had always shown. Yet the stories circulating beyond her hearing quietly altered the way others interpreted her behavior. Servants often played an invisible role in this transformation. They carried messages between rooms, observed interactions between members of the household, and repeated small details during conversations in kitchens or courtyards. Even without intending harm, their observations contributed to the narrative that gradually formed around the family. Over time, the household itself seemed to adapt to these changing impressions. Visitors directed warmer conversation toward the woman, believed to offer sympathy and understanding. The wife continued to occupy her official role, yet fewer people sought her counsel in the same way they once had. The transformation occurred so gradually that it rarely appeared deliberate. No document declared that the wife had become distant. No accusation announced that the mistress held greater emotional influence. Instead, the story surrounding the household changed quietly, and once a new story takes hold within a community, it often becomes stronger than any formal title. Perception within Tudor society could shape power as strongly as law or inheritance. A wife might retain her official role, while quiet stories gradually recast her as distant and cold. Once that narrative spread through conversations and impressions, the balance of influence inside the household had already begun to shift. Reputation in Tudor society did not disappear in a single moment. It faded slowly, like a familiar voice growing quieter in a crowded room. A noblewoman who once stood confidently at the center of her household might still carry the same title, wear the same clothing, and occupy the same chambers. Yet the attention that once surrounded her could gradually drift elsewhere. At first, the difference appeared almost invisible. Visitors still greeted her politely when they entered the manor. Servants still bowed when passing her in the corridors. Her seat remained beside her husband during formal dinners, exactly where tradition expected it to be. Nothing in the structure of the household had formally changed. Yet the subtle currents of influence within the house had already begun to move in another direction. In earlier years, guests arriving at the estate often sought the wife's presence immediately. She represented the dignity and intelligence of the household. Conversations unfolded around her during meals, and visitors frequently asked for her advice regarding family matters, alliance, or the delicate politics that shaped noble life. Her voice carried quiet authority. People listened when she spoke. Gradually, however, those conversations began to shift. A guest who once approached her first might now turn towards someone else in the room. A visitor might greet her warmly, yet direct a deeper discussion toward the husband or another figure within the household. These moments appeared harmless when viewed individually, yet together they marked the beginning of a change. Influence in Tudor society depended heavily on attention. Those who commanded attention shaped the direction of conversation, guided alliances, and quietly influenced decisions that extended far beyond the walls of the manor. When that attention moved elsewhere, authority often followed it. The wife might notice that fewer people lingered near her during gatherings. Conversations around the table might flow past her rather than through her. Guests might listen politely when she spoke, but no longer seek her opinion with the same eagerness. None of these changes arrived with an explanation. No one announced that her influence had weakened. The household continued its routines with the same outward calm. Meals were served, guests arrived and departed, and the rhythm of noble life remained orderly and controlled. Yet the emotional center of attention had begun to settle somewhere else. Servants noticed the change as well. They observed which voices drew the master's interest during conversations. They noticed who remained, surrounded by guests after dinners ended. In the quiet hierarchy of the household, such details revealed more about power than any formal declaration ever could. Over time, these observations influenced behavior. Visitors who sensed that the wife no longer held the same central role adjusted their conduct accordingly. They continued to treat her with respect, yet their curiosity and attention increasingly focused elsewhere. The difference between respect and influence slowly became visible. Respect remained part of her title. Influence belonged to those who commanded attention. In Tudor society, where reputation spread through networks of conversation, This difference carried enormous weight. A noble woman who once shaped the atmosphere of a gathering might find herself listening rather than guiding the discussion. Her presence had not vanished, yet the space around her had grown quieter. The wife might still host the meal, yet fewer guests asked for her thoughts after the table had been cleared. She might still stand beside her husband during ceremonies, yet conversations moved around her rather than toward her. This transformation rarely caused immediate alarm. The change happened slowly enough that it could be mistaken for a coincidence. One quiet evening might pass without notice, then another. Gradually, what once felt unusual began to feel ordinary. The wife herself might struggle to identify when the shift had truly begun. She still held her place in the household. She still fulfilled the responsibilities expected of her. The marriage itself still appeared intact to those who looked from the outside. Yet influence often disappears before authority does. A noble woman could retain her title long after the conversations that once defined her importance had moved elsewhere. In many Tudor households, the fading of reputation occurred not through scandal or confrontation, but through the quiet absence of attention. People simply stopped seeking her voice. They spoke around her rather than to her. They listened politely without inviting her counsel. In time, this silence became its own form of removal. The wife remained present within the household, yet the center of social life no longer revolved around her in the same way it once had. What had begun as small shifts in conversation gradually reshaped how everyone within the estate understood her role. No accusation had been made. No public humiliation had taken place. Yet the process of fading had already begun. The wife still carried her title and remained within the household structure, yet fewer voices turned toward her, and fewer conversations sought her counsel. In Tudor society, disappearance often began not with conflict, but with the quiet act of being forgotten. Space inside a Tudor manor carried meaning far beyond comfort or convenience. Rooms were not simply places to sleep or dine. They formed a quiet map of authority within the household, where a person slept, where they received guests, and how close their chambers stood to the great hall could reveal their true position within the life of the estate. The wife of the house traditionally occupied chambers close to the center of activity. These rooms were often located near the great hall or along the main corridors where guests and servants frequently passed. Their location ensured that the lady of the manor remained visible within the daily rhythm of the household. Visitors could easily be received there, and servants could reach her quickly when decisions about meals, guests, or household matters required attention. The arrangement reinforced her role as the central figure within domestic life. When the balance of influence inside the household began to change, this arrangement sometimes changed as well. Yet the transformation rarely happened through a direct order or obvious removal. Tudor households valued dignity and appearances too strongly for such blunt actions. Instead, the shift often appeared as a practical adjustment. Perhaps the wife moved to quieter rooms because the older chambers required repair. Perhaps the household expanded, and certain rooms were needed for guests. Perhaps the new arrangement simply seemed more convenient for managing certain responsibilities. Each explanation sounded reasonable. Gradually, however, the new rooms placed the wife further from the spaces where the social life of the household unfolded. The corridors outside her chambers carried fewer footsteps. Fewer servants passed her door throughout the day. The distance between her and the great hall grew slightly longer. No one described this as a loss of status. Yet the geography of the house had quietly changed. Meanwhile, another presence began appearing more frequently in the central spaces of the manor. The mistress, who once remained confined to the private edges of the estate, might now be seen more often near the great hall or in the smaller reception rooms where informal conversations occurred. Her presence there was rarely announced. A guest might notice her speaking with the master of the house in a side chamber. Another visitor might encounter her during an evening gathering where she had once been absent. At first, these appearances seemed accidental, the result of coincidence rather than intention. But the pattern gradually repeated itself. Over time, the spaces where conversation and attention gathered began to include her presence more regularly. Servants preparing the great hall noticed that she lingered nearby during certain evenings. Messages intended for the master of the house sometimes passed through her hands before reaching him. The house itself seemed to adjust to this new rhythm. Rooms that once hosted the wife's gatherings now remained quiet. Other chambers, closer to the center of the estate, became the places where conversation flowed most freely. Guests entering the manor began to associate those spaces with the person they encountered there most often. In Tudor society, physical space carried symbolic weight. To stand near the center of the house was to be visible within its hierarchy. To occupy rooms near the Great Hall suggested influence over the daily life of the estate. Distance from those spaces could slowly reshape how others perceived a person's role within the household. The wife still retained her title and authority over many domestic responsibilities. Servants still addressed her with respect, and her name remained connected to the dignity of the marriage. Yet the physical arrangement of the manor now told a slightly different story. Visitors who walked through the central corridors encountered another presence more often than hers. Conversations that once unfolded near her chambers now occurred elsewhere. The pathways of daily movement within the house had quietly shifted. Servants, who understood the silent language of households better than anyone else, adapted quickly. They carried messages through different corridors. They prepared certain rooms more frequently than others. They learned which doors guests approached most often. Within the quiet discipline of the manor, such adjustments rarely required explanation. The wife might notice the change slowly. Her chambers felt calmer than before. The noise of gatherings reached her less often. Fewer footsteps passed outside her door. From a practical perspective, nothing had been taken from her. She still possessed comfortable rooms, still commanded servants, and still represented the household during formal occasions when her presence was required. Yet the center of activity within the estate had begun to settle elsewhere. The mistress, without ever claiming the position openly, now appeared closer to the spaces where influence gathered naturally. Conversations, meetings, and private discussions increasingly occurred in rooms where she could be found. The house itself seemed to tell a new story. Rooms once associated with the wife's authority had grown quiet. Rooms near the heart of the estate carried a different voice. No declaration had announced the change. Yet anyone walking through the corridors could sense that the symbolic center of the household had begun to move. The wife still possessed her chambers and her title within the household. Yet the spaces where attention and influence gathered had slowly shifted elsewhere. In Tudor houses, power often revealed itself not through words, but through the rooms where people chose to stand. Children in a Tudor household rarely understood the quiet tensions unfolding around them. Yet they lived within the atmosphere those tensions created. The great halls, corridors, and gardens of a noble estate formed the world in which they learned how authority worked, how loyalty was expressed, and how relationships between adults shaped the structure of family life. From an early age, children observed more than their parents often realized. They noticed who spoke most confidently during meals. They noticed whose instructions servants obeyed without hesitation. They noticed which voices their father listened to most carefully. In noble families, the upbringing of sons carried particular importance. A son was not simply a child. He was the future heir to the estate, the continuation of the family's name, and the figure who would eventually inherit both land and responsibility. Because of this, fathers often took a strong interest in shaping their sons' understanding of authority. When the balance within a marriage began to shift, that influence could extend into the education of the children as well. The son might still respect his mother as the lady of the house. She remained the person who had guided his early childhood and supervised the rhythms of daily life. Yet as he grew older, the father's authority began to dominate the lessons that shaped his understanding of power. Fathers taught sons how to manage estates, negotiate alliances, and command loyalty from those who served them. These lessons often took place during private conversations, horseback rides across the estate, or visits to neighbouring families where political relationships were discussed. Within these moments, the son learned whose judgment carried the greatest weight. If the father increasingly relied on voices other than his wife's counsel, the son quietly absorbed that pattern. He saw which opinions shaped decisions and which voices received the most attention. Over time, these observations influenced how he understood the hierarchy within his own household. Respect for the mother remained, yet obedience began to align more strongly with the father. This shift did not require anyone to speak about it directly. The lessons of authority were often learned through observation rather than instruction. A son who watched his father consult someone other than his mother might gradually interpret that behavior as a sign of where influence truly rested. Meanwhile, the relationship between mother and child could begin to change in subtle ways. The mother still supervised daily routines, ensured proper manners, and oversaw the early education of younger children. Yet the emotional closeness that once defined the relationship sometimes became interrupted by the growing structure of authority within the household. As sons grew older, they spent more time under the guidance of tutors, mentors, and their father himself. Their days might include lessons in reading, riding, diplomacy, and estate management. These experiences gradually pulled them away from the domestic world, where their mother had once been the centre of attention. Distance slowly replaced familiarity. The mother still existed within the household, yet the role she played in shaping her son's future appeared smaller compared to the authority exercised by his father and the advisors surrounding him. This transformation could quietly influence how the next generation perceived her position. Children often mirrored the patterns they observed around them. If the household treated the mother's voice with less importance than before, the son might unconsciously adopt the same attitude. Respect remained part of his upbringing, yet the instinct to seek guidance from her could weaken over time. The daughter, too, might sense the change. Young girls often learned the expectations of a noble life. By watching their mothers, they observed how a woman carried herself in gatherings, how she spoke with guests, and how she managed the delicate relationships that defined aristocratic society. When the mother's presence within those spaces diminished, the daughter's understanding of that role shifted as well. She might still admire her mother's dignity and restraint, yet she also noticed which figures commanded the most attention in the household. The lessons she absorbed about influence and authority came not only from words, but from the patterns of daily life unfolding around her. Servants observed these dynamics with careful attention. They noticed which instructions the children followed most quickly. They noticed whose approval the young heir sought during conversations. They noticed the subtle distance that sometimes formed between mother and child as authority rearranged itself within the household. None of this required open conflict. The mother remained a respected figure within the estate. She continued to guide younger children, maintain the dignity of the household, and fulfill the responsibilities expected of her position. Yet, the next generation gradually learned to view authority through a different lens. They saw the father as the ultimate source of decision-making. They noticed the voices that influenced his thinking. They absorbed the quiet hierarchy shaping the family long before they inherited responsibility themselves. Over time, these lessons shaped how the household would be governed in the future. The mother still existed within their lives, but the image they carried of her authority had begun to fade. Children in Tudor households learned about power by watching the adults around them. As influence within the marriage shifted, the next generation quietly absorbed the same hierarchy. What they observed in childhood would shape how they understood authority long after they inherited the estate themselves. Servants in a Tudor household often understood the movements of power long before the noble family itself acknowledged them. They lived inside the rhythm of the manor every day, walking the same corridors, carrying the same trays, and listening to conversations that drifted through half-open doors. Their lives depended on reading the subtle signals that revealed where authority truly rested. A noble family might believe its secrets remained private. Yet servants observed everything. They noticed which footsteps approached the master's chambers late in the evening. They noticed whose voice he listened to most closely during quiet discussions. They noticed which names appeared most often in the instructions delivered to the household staff. None of these observations required explanation. Within the silent discipline of service, recognizing the direction of power was simply part of survival. A servant who misread those signals could easily find themselves dismissed, replaced by someone more attentive to the changing atmosphere of the household. Because of this, servants developed a careful instinct for shifts in influence. They watched, they listened, they adapted. At the beginning, their loyalty toward their wives remained strong. She had long been the central authority over domestic matters. She directed the kitchens, supervised the servants responsible for cleaning and clothing, and often maintained the delicate order that allowed the household to function smoothly. Her presence shaped the daily rhythm of the manor. Servants brought her reports about supplies, repairs, and guests arriving at the gates. They sought her approval before making adjustments to routines that affected the running of the estate. Respect for her authority had been built through years of familiarity. Yet servants also understood that loyalty in noble households was rarely unconditional. Their position depended on the favor of those who controlled the estate's future. And the person who held that favor most strongly was often the master of the house. When his attention gradually began to center on another presence within the manor, the servants noticed immediately. At first, the change appeared subtle. A servant carrying wine into a private chamber might see the mistress seated beside the master during a quiet conversation. A maid preparing candles might notice that the same room was being arranged more frequently in the evenings. These moments seemed small, but servants were trained to recognize patterns. When a pattern repeated often enough, it revealed something important about the balance of influence within the household. Slowly, their behavior began to adjust to this new understanding. The mistress still lacked any official authority within the estate. She did not command the servants directly, nor did she possess the formal position required to issue orders. Yet servants understood that the master's attention carried its own form of power. If she occupied his confidence, her requests began to carry greater weight. A servant might respond more quickly when she asked for something small. Another might ensure that her chamber remained especially comfortable. A maid might deliver messages to her with a slightly deeper bow than before. None of these gestures appeared dramatic. They unfolded quietly within daily routines. Over time, however, the difference became noticeable. Servants who once directed every question toward the wife might now occasionally turn toward the mistress when uncertainty arose. They did not openly abandon the wife. Such behavior would have risked scandal within the household. Instead, their loyalty gradually stretched in two directions. Outwardly, they continued to treat the wife with the respect required by her title. Yet in practice, their attention increasingly followed the path of influence surrounding the master. The servants were not making moral judgments. They were simply adapting. Inside large estates, where dozens of people depended on the stability of employment, understanding the direction of authority mattered more than personal loyalty. A servant who misjudged the future of the household could easily lose their position when circumstances changed. So they watched carefully. They listened to conversations in the kitchens and corridors. They observed who remained closest to the master during gatherings. They noted whose presence shaped the atmosphere of the manor. Gradually, the wife sensed the difference. Servants still obeyed her instructions. Yet the immediate attentiveness she once commanded seemed to soften. Requests that were once carried out instantly might now take slightly longer. Messages passed through the household with a quieter energy. Nothing had openly broken, yet the invisible thread of loyalty had loosened. Meanwhile, the mistress began receiving small gestures of courtesy that once belonged exclusively to the lady of the house. Doors opened more quickly when she approached. Servants waited nearby when she spoke with the master, ready to assist without being summoned. These changes unfolded so gradually that they rarely caused open conflict. The household continued functioning smoothly. Meals were prepared, fires were lit, and guests were welcomed into the great hall with the same practiced efficiency. To an outsider, nothing within the estate appeared unusual. Yet beneath that calm order, the servants had already recognized the direction in which the household's balance of power was moving. Their quiet agreement required no words. It was expressed through attention, through small gestures, and through the instinctive adjustments that allowed them to remain secure within the changing structure of the manor. In the silent world of Tudor service, survival depended on understanding where authority would stand tomorrow, not where it had stood yesterday. Servants rarely declared loyalty with words, yet their behavior revealed the household's shifting balance. Their quiet adjustments reflected the growing influence surrounding the master and the woman closest to him. Once the servants began to follow that new current of authority, the entire house was already changing its allegiance. Life inside a Tudor manor often appeared calm from the outside. The great hall remained orderly. Meals were served on time, and the routines of daily work continued without interruption. Guests arriving at the gates might see nothing unusual as they crossed the courtyard and entered the house. Yet inside those walls, attitudes could change in ways that no visitor immediately understood. No announcement was made. No confrontation took place. Still, the atmosphere within the household had begun to shift. In earlier years, the lady of the house had moved through the manor, surrounded by quiet acknowledgement. Servants greeted her with confidence. Guests approached her naturally during gatherings, and her presence shaped the rhythm of conversation within the estate. She had been the visible center of the household's dignity. Over time, however, something subtle altered the way people looked at her. It began with small moments that seemed almost accidental. A servant might hesitate briefly before answering her request, as though measuring the tone of the room before responding. A visitor might greet her politely, but allow their attention to drift toward another figure nearby. These gestures appeared harmless on their own, yet they repeated often enough to form a pattern. Inside large households, behavior spreads quickly through observation. Servants learn how to act by watching each other. Guests sense where influence lies by observing which voices attract attention. When enough people begin responding differently to the same person, the atmosphere of the entire house slowly adjusts. Soon, no one needed to explain what had changed. The signals were already visible. Servants continued to address the wife respectfully. Yet their movements around her grew more formal than familiar. They waited for instructions, rather than anticipating her wishes as they once had. Their eyes shifted quickly toward the master of the house whenever uncertainty arose. The difference was small, but it carried meaning. Guests also began to behave differently. During dinners, the conversation might flow more easily toward the master and the woman who now shared many of his private discussions. The wife remained present at the table, yet her voice no longer shaped the direction of the gathering in the same way. People listened to her politely, but they listened more carefully to others. The change rarely involved open hostility. No one insulted the wife or treated her without courtesy. Tudor society valued appearances too strongly for such open disrespect. Instead, the transformation occurred within gestures too quiet to provoke scandal. Eyes turned elsewhere. Attention gathered around different voices. Influence began to settle in new places. Within the household, servants noticed these patterns immediately. Their daily routines placed them at the edges of every conversation and movement within the manor. They saw which guests lingered near certain doors. They heard whose name appeared most often in the master's instructions. Soon, their behavior reflected the same understanding. When preparing rooms for evening gatherings, they arranged spaces where the master preferred to speak with his closest companion. When guests arrived, they guided them naturally toward those same areas of the house. None of this required a spoken command. The servants had already chosen how to move within the changing structure of the household. Even the children sensed the difference. Young heirs and daughters often absorbed the emotional atmosphere of the house without fully understanding it. They noticed where laughter came from during evening conversations. They noticed who stood beside their father when guests arrived. Gradually, they began directing their attention in the same direction. The wife remained part of the household. She still occupied her chambers, attended formal meals, and fulfilled the duties expected of her position. Yet the quiet network of attention that once surrounded her had loosened. What replaced it was not open rejection. It was an absence. She might walk through the corridors and notice that conversations paused differently when she entered. Servants bowed as before, yet their eyes returned quickly to the work they had been doing. The house had not expelled her, but it no longer moved around her. Within the silent politics of Tudor households, this change carried enormous weight. Influence did not always disappear through conflict. Often, it dissolved through a gradual withdrawal of attention. Once enough people behaved differently, the shift became permanent. Every glance, every hesitation, every redirected conversation contributed to the same quiet outcome. The wife still lived inside the manor, yet the house itself no longer revolved around her presence. The household had not declared any open judgment against the wife. Yet every gesture, every glance, and every quiet adjustment revealed that loyalties had already settled elsewhere. When an entire house begins to move in the same direction, the person left standing still becomes visible in a very painful way. Marriage in Tudor England was never simply a private arrangement between two individuals. It existed within a powerful framework shaped by both the law and the church. These institutions defined what marriage meant, how it could be challenged, and how far a husband or wife could move before the structure itself began to break. To the outside world, marriage appeared permanent. The church taught that the union between husband and wife carried sacred meaning. It was not meant to be dissolved easily, and certainly not because affection had faded. Once vows had been spoken before witnesses and priests. The bond was expected to endure for life. For this reason, divorce in the modern sense did not exist in the way people today might imagine. Yet that did not mean a marriage could never be undone. Tudor society possessed complicated legal pathways that allowed couples to separate under certain conditions. These processes required the involvement of church courts, where judges examined accusations, testimony, and evidence related to the conduct of both spouses. The process was slow and often humiliating. Every detail of private life could be exposed to public scrutiny. Servants might be called to testify about behavior within the household. Neighbors might be asked to describe arguments they had overheard or rumors they had encountered. Such investigations rarely ended quietly. Because of this, many families avoided formal separation unless the situation had become impossible to conceal. A scandal carried enormous risk in a noble society, where reputation shaped alliances, inheritance, and political relationships. The law offered a path toward ending a marriage, but that path could damage everyone involved. Within this fragile structure, accusations of moral wrongdoing became powerful tools. A spouse who wished to weaken the other's position might begin gathering evidence suggesting misconduct, allegations of adultery, cruelty, or neglect could be presented to church authorities as reasons to question the legitimacy of the marriage. Even when such accusations remained unproven, the suspicion itself carried weight. In Tudor culture, reputation functioned almost as strongly as legal judgment. A noblewoman accused of improper behavior might find her dignity damaged long before any official verdict appeared. Because of this, the threat of accusation alone could create enormous pressure. Families understood that once a case entered the church courts, the details would spread quickly through social networks. Noble households relied heavily on honor and stability to maintain alliances with other families. The possibility of scandal threatened not only the couple involved, but also the wider network connected to them. Under these conditions, quiet withdrawal sometimes seemed safer than open conflict. A wife who sensed growing hostility within her household might recognize the risks of resisting publicly. If accusations began to circulate, she could face the humiliation of defending her conduct before judges and witnesses. Such a process could damage her reputation, even if she ultimately proved innocent. For many women, the possibility of this outcome created enormous pressure. Instead of waiting for the conflict to reach the courts, some wives chose a different path. They gradually removed themselves from the center of household life, allowing distance to grow between themselves and the structures of authority surrounding their husbands. This withdrawal did not necessarily involve formal separation. Often, it meant retreating to a quieter estate, spending longer periods away from the main household, or focusing on religious life and charitable work. These actions allowed the appearance of dignity to remain intact while reducing the tension that might otherwise lead to open confrontation. From the outside, the arrangement could appear calm and respectable. The marriage technically continued. The wife retained her title and position within the family lineage, yet her influence over daily decisions and household life had quietly diminished. The husband, meanwhile, avoided the public scandal that might accompany a legal battle. His reputation remained stable, and the household preserved the outward image of order and discipline that noble families worked hard to maintain. The church and the law, therefore, shaped the conflict without necessarily resolving it. Their presence created boundaries that limited how openly power could be contested within marriage, because those boundaries made divorce difficult and public accusations dangerous. Many households developed quieter strategies for managing internal tensions. Pressure replaced confrontation. Reputation replaced direct accusation. Silence replaced open judgment. Within this environment, the wife's withdrawal often appeared voluntary, even when it had been shaped by forces beyond her control. Thompson, the legal and religious structures surrounding marriage rarely forced a woman out of her position directly. Instead, they created conditions in which remaining at the center became increasingly difficult. A household could therefore change its balance of influence without ever breaking the marriage itself. The law remained intact. The church recognized the union. The public image of stability survived. Yet the quiet reality inside the household told a different story. Marriage in Tudor England was protected by powerful legal and religious structures. Yet those same structures could also create pressures that slowly pushed a wife away from the center of household life. Once law, reputation, and private alliances began to converge, the balance of power inside the marriage could change without a single, formal judgment being spoken. In the early stages of a secret relationship within a Tudor household, the mistress usually remained hidden in the quiet edges of the estate. Her presence was known to only a few people. Meetings happened in private chambers, distant gardens, or during moments when the rhythms of the household allowed conversations to remain unnoticed. Discretion protected everyone involved. The husband avoided a scandal. The mistress avoided public shame. The wife, at least outwardly, remained the unquestioned center of the household. Yet secrecy rarely lasts forever when affection grows into influence. Over time, the mistress might begin appearing in places where her presence once would have seemed impossible. At first, these appearances seemed accidental. Small moments that could easily be explained away. A guest might notice her passing through a corridor near the Great Hall. A servant might see her seated in a reception room during a quiet afternoon conversation. A visitor might encounter her walking beside the master of the house in the gardens. None of these moments appeared scandalous on their own. They simply suggested familiarity. Gradually, however, those small appearances became more frequent. The mistress began to occupy spaces where informal gatherings took place. These were not the grand ceremonies of Tudor society, where strict rules defined who could attend and where each person stood. Instead, they were quieter occasions, private dinners, conversations among trusted friends, evenings where a handful of guests gathered around a table rather than filling the entire great hall. In such settings, the presence of the mistress could be explained as companionship rather than defiance. Guests might notice her seated nearby during conversation. She listened attentively, occasionally offering thoughtful remarks that revealed intelligence and awareness of household matters. The master of the house might turn toward her when discussing certain decisions, asking for her opinion with the natural ease that came from familiarity. At first, these gestures seemed harmless, yet the repetition of those moments slowly changed how others perceived her role. Servants noticed that the master consulted her more often during private discussions. Visitors observed that she remained present during conversations that touched on family plans, estate management, or alliances with neighboring families. Influence often begins in such quiet settings. The mistress did not need official authority to shape the direction of a discussion. Her closeness to the master allowed her voice to carry weight in moments where decisions were being formed rather than announced. Over time, she became more than a private companion. She became a participant. Household decisions that once belonged entirely to the husband and wife now unfolded within conversations where the mistress was present. She might suggest a solution to a small conflict between servants. She might express an opinion about a guest whose loyalty seemed uncertain. These suggestions appeared gentle rather than commanding, yet they slowly shaped the atmosphere of the household. Servants noticed that the master sometimes followed her advice. Guests recognized that her words carried influence during discussions that affected the estate's future. Gradually, people began to treat her differently. They did not refer to her with a formal title. Tudor society offered no legitimate place for a mistress within the structure of marriage. Yet the absence of a title did not prevent others from recognizing her growing importance. Respect emerged in subtle forms. Servants listened carefully when she spoke. Guests greeted her with greater attention. The master himself often directed conversation toward her when important matters arose. Through these quiet adjustments, she began to occupy a position that had no official name. The wife still held the lawful place within the marriage. Her title remained secure, and her identity continued to represent the dignity of the family in public ceremonies. Yet within the daily life of the household, another center of gravity had begun to appear. The mistress did not replace the wife openly. Such a transformation would have provoked scandal throughout the region. Instead, the household simply began moving around her presence more frequently. Conversations flowed naturally toward her during gatherings. The master sought her company when discussing matters that once belonged entirely to the marriage. Influence gathered around familiarity, and familiarity often created its own quiet authority. Over time, those who entered the house began to sense the shift. They might not fully understand how the balance had changed. Yet they noticed which voice the master trusted most closely. They noticed who stood beside him when decisions were made. Without any formal declaration, the mistress had moved from the shadows of the household into its visible life. She still possessed no title, yet she had become something equally powerful. The woman whose presence shaped the direction of the house. The mistress had once existed only in the quiet corners of the household. Gradually, her presence appeared in the spaces where conversations and decisions unfolded. In Tudor homes, the person without a title could still become the one everyone watched most closely. In Tudor society, reputation could protect a man almost as effectively as law or wealth. A nobleman understood that his position within the community depended not only on the land he owned or the alliances he maintained, but also on the image he presented to those around him. To appear honorable, calm, and disciplined mattered as much as any formal declaration of authority. Because of this, many men learned how to navigate domestic conflict without appearing openly cruel. When the balance within a marriage began to shift, a husband rarely announced his intentions directly. Doing so would invite questions, rumors, and perhaps even intervention from relatives or religious authorities. Instead, the transformation often unfolded through patience and restraint. The husband continued to behave with outward courtesy toward his wife. He spoke to her politely during meals. He maintained the formal respect expected between noble spouses. He avoided any gesture that might appear openly humiliating. To observers, the marriage still looked intact. Guests arriving at the manor would see the husband greeting his wife with calm dignity. Servants heard no raised voices echoing through the corridors. The great hall continued to host dinners where husband and wife sat at the same table. Nothing suggested a household in conflict. This appearance of civility protected the husband's reputation. In Tudor culture, a man who openly mistreated his lawful wife risked criticism from both church authorities and neighbouring families. Harsh treatment could provoke questions about his character and undermine the alliances that supported his position in society. By avoiding visible cruelty, the husband preserved the image of a reasonable and disciplined leader of his household. At the same time, the deeper structure of the marriage quietly changed. He did not remove his wife by force. He did not publicly accuse her of wrongdoing. He did not declare that her place in the household had weakened. Instead, he allowed circumstances to evolve naturally around her. Decisions that once required her counsel might now be discussed with others. Invitations to gatherings might arrive less frequently in her name. Conversations during meals might flow toward different voices within the room. Each moment seemed small and easily explained. Together, however, they formed a pattern that gradually reshaped the balance of influence inside the household. The husband rarely appeared responsible for these changes. If guests asked why the wife no longer attended certain gatherings, he might simply explain that she preferred quiet evenings or that she had been feeling tired lately. His tone remained sympathetic, even protective. He never spoke harshly about her. Such restraint strengthened his image as a considerate partner. Servants also noticed this careful behavior. The master never issued commands that openly diminished his wife's authority. He did not instruct them to ignore her or to treat her with less respect. Officially, her role within the household remained unchanged. Yet servants could see where the master's attention truly rested. They watched which conversations occupied his evenings. They noticed whose advice he sought during moments of decision. They observed who stood closest to him when guests arrived. Without receiving explicit instructions, they adjusted their own behavior to match the direction of his attention. In this way, the husband allowed the structure of the household to change without ever appearing responsible for the transformation. He remained calm, courteous, and outwardly loyal to the marriage. The shifting dynamics seemed to emerge naturally from the circumstances surrounding the family. Neighbors and visiting relatives often interpreted the situation through the same lens. From their perspective, the husband behaved honorably. He had not driven his wife away through cruelty or anger. He had simply continued his life with patience while the rhythms of the household evolved. The absence of open conflict made the situation easier to accept. In a society where public scandal could destroy reputations, quiet change often appeared preferable to dramatic confrontation. People were more comfortable believing that relationships had simply drifted apart than acknowledging the deliberate forces shaping that drift. The husband understood this instinct well. By maintaining calm dignity, he protected himself from criticism. His reputation remained stable, and his position within the community continued to appear respectable. Meanwhile, the household itself slowly reorganized around the new center of influence. To those watching from the outside, he remained an honorable man navigating a difficult domestic situation with patience and restraint. Yet within the walls of the manor, the effect of his silence was powerful. The wife found herself gradually removed from the conversations and decisions that once defined her role. The mistress, meanwhile, became increasingly present in the spaces where influence gathered. No command had created this outcome, yet the result was unmistakable. The husband never needed to raise his voice or issue harsh orders to reshape the household. By remaining calm and allowing circumstances to unfold quietly, he preserved the image of innocence that protected his reputation. When power moves without visible force, responsibility becomes difficult for anyone to prove. The disappearance of influence in a Tudor household rarely resembled a dramatic fall. There were no public accusations shouted across the great hall. No formal declarations read before gathered guests, and no moment when the household suddenly turned against the wife in open hostility. Instead, the change unfolded quietly, almost politely, as though the house itself had decided to move on without ever saying so aloud. The wife still lived within the estate. Her chambers remained prepared each morning. Servants continued to greet her with bows and respectful titles. During formal occasions, she might still appear beside her husband, dressed in the dignified clothing expected of a noblewoman. From the outside, nothing had collapsed. Yet inside the daily rhythm of the house, something essential had already vanished. Once, her presence had shaped the movement of the household. Guests waited to hear her opinion before speaking openly about family matters. Servants looked toward her when decisions about gatherings, meals, or visitors needed to be made. She had been part of every important conversation. Now those conversations occurred elsewhere, in private rooms closer to the center of the manor. Discussions about alliances, finance, and family plans continued without her participation. Voices gathered around the master and the woman who now shared much of his time. The difference was rarely announced. People simply stopped expecting her to be present. At dinners, guests might begin speaking about certain topics without turning toward her for confirmation. When messages arrived concerning estate business, they might be delivered directly to the master rather than passing through her chambers as they once had. Each small moment suggested the same quiet reality. Her role had faded. No one had pronounced a judgment against her. Tudor society valued dignity too strongly for such public humiliation. Instead, the household maintained the appearance that nothing unusual had happened. The marriage still existed. The wife still held her title. The family name continued unchanged. Yet the center of the household had shifted so completely that her presence no longer shaped its direction. Visitors sensed the difference without fully understanding it. They noticed that conversations moved towards certain voices during gatherings. They observed that the master's attention rarely turned toward his wife when important matters were discussed. No one explained why. It simply seemed natural. Servants adapted to this new order as well. They continued to serve the wife with the respect required by her position. Yet their daily routines increasingly revolved around other figures within the house. Messages moved through different corridors. Meals were arranged around different conversations. Guests lingered near different doors. The wife remained within the manor, yet the life of the household flowed past her rather than through her. In many ways, this transformation resembled a disappearance. But it was not the kind of disappearance marked by mourning or ceremony. When someone died in Tudor society, bells rang from the church tower. Black cloth covered the halls. Prayers filled the chapel, and neighbors gathered to witness the passing of a life. Nothing like that accompanied the fading of influence within a household. There was no announcement, no farewell, no recognition that something meaningful had ended. The wife still existed within the structure of the family, yet the role she once occupied had quietly been taken by someone else. The mistress, who once remained hidden in private chambers, now appeared naturally within the daily life of the house. She joined conversations that shaped the future of the estate. Guests spoke with her comfortably during gatherings. Servants waited for her instructions with growing attentiveness. Her presence filled the spaces where the wife's influence had once lived. And yet, even this transformation remained unspoken. The household never acknowledged that a replacement had occurred. Such honesty would have threatened the delicate balance of reputation that noble families depended upon. Instead, everyone behaved as though the arrangement had simply evolved. The wife did not disappear from the house, but the house had quietly moved on without her. In Tudor society, such outcomes were rarely recorded in official documents. Histories often focused on wars, kings, and political alliances. The slow fading of a woman's place within her own household rarely appeared in those records. Yet within the lives of the families who experienced it, the effect was deeply real. A person could remain physically present and still lose the position that once defined their existence. And when that happened, the silence surrounding the change often spoke louder than any accusation ever could. The wife remained within the household, yet the role that once centered around her had quietly vanished. Conversations continued. Decisions were made, and the life of the manor moved forward without acknowledging what had been lost. Sometimes, the most complete disappearance happens without a farewell, leaving only a quiet replacement standing where someone else once belonged. The end of influence inside a Tudor household rarely arrived with a dramatic event. There was no formal announcement declaring that the wife's position had ended, no legal document stating that she had lost her place. Instead, the final stage of the process often appeared as a quiet rearrangement of life itself. The wife simply began living somewhere else. For many noble women, this meant leaving the main household and settling in a smaller estate belonging to the family. Tudor landowners often possessed several properties scattered across the countryside. Some served as administrative centres for farming or trade, while others existed mainly as quiet residences, far from the activity of court or city life. A wife whose presence had grown inconvenient within the main house might gradually be encouraged to spend more time at one of these distant estates. The explanation rarely sounded hostile. Perhaps the countryside air would benefit her health. Perhaps the estate required supervision that only a member of the family could provide. Perhaps the quiet surroundings would offer comfort and dignity away from the noise of social obligations. Each reason appeared thoughtful, yet the effect remained the same. Distance. The countryside estate offered privacy, but it also removed the wife from the centre of family life. The political discussions, social gatherings, and daily decisions shaping the future of the household continued elsewhere. In the quieter house where she now lived, time moved differently. The great hall might remain silent for days at a time. Servants carried out their duties with calm efficiency, yet fewer guests arrived at the gates. Letters from relatives and allies reached her less frequently as conversations shifted toward the household where influence now gathered. She had not been expelled, yet she had been relocated to the margins of the family's world. In the main household, life continued with familiar energy. The husband remained surrounded by advisors, guests, and the companion who had gradually become central to his private life. Visitors arriving at the estate rarely asked where the wife had gone. They already understood. Tudor society possessed its own quiet vocabulary for such situations. People referred to the wife respectfully when her name appeared in conversation. They might describe her as a gentlewoman who preferred the peace of the countryside. The phrasing sounded kind, yet the meaning carried distance. She was no longer the woman shaping the family's future. Instead, she became part of the family's past. Over time, even the way people remembered her began to change. When new guests heard her name, it often appeared in a particular form of description. She was spoken of as the first wife. The phrase carried both recognition and finality. It acknowledged her role in the family's history, while quietly suggesting that her importance now belonged to an earlier chapter of that story. The words sounded neutral, yet they marked the completion of her disappearance from the centre of household life. Her influence over political alliances faded as well. Noble marriages often served as bridges connecting families, estates, and political interests. When a wife moved away from the household where those negotiations occurred, her voice gradually vanished from those conversations. Letters seeking advice were sent elsewhere. Guests seeking influence spoke with other figures. Alliances formed without her presence. Her title remained attached to the family name, but the authority once carried by that title slowly weakened. Even the servants who lived at the distant estate recognized the difference. They treated her with the respect owed to a noblewoman. Yet they also understood that the decisions shaping the family's future were being made far away. Their loyalty remained courteous rather than powerful. Years could pass in this quiet arrangement. The wife lived comfortably enough, surrounded by land, or servants, and the familiar rhythms of estate life. From the outside, Her existence appeared stable and respectable, yet stability is not the same as influence. The political world of Tudor England moved quickly, shaped by alliances, negotiations, and the constant exchange of favours among powerful families. Remaining distant from that network meant gradually disappearing from it. Eventually, her name appeared less often in letters and discussions. New generations within the family grew up without remembering the time when she had once stood at the centre of the household. The transformation was complete. She had not died. She had not been publicly disgraced. She had not lost her title. Yet the life that once defined her role within the family had quietly continued without her. In the histories of powerful families, such endings rarely received attention. Chroniclers wrote about battles, inheritances, and political marriages. They rarely wrote about the quiet exile of a woman who had once held the lawful place beside her husband. But within the quiet halls of distant estates across Tudor England, many such women lived out their lives, surrounded by the dignity of titles that no longer carried the power they once had. The wife still possessed her name, her estate, and the respect attached to her position. Yet distance slowly erased her voice from the conversations shaping the family's future. In Tudor memory, she remained acknowledged as the first woman of the house, even as the household itself moved forward without her. A Tudor household that preserved its reputation through silence often appeared calm to the outside world. Visitors entering the manor might see polished silver on the dining tables, orderly servants moving through the corridors, and a noble family presenting itself with quiet dignity. The structure of respect remained intact, and the family name continued to carry the authority it had always possessed. Yet beneath that calm surface, the emotional life of the household often grew far more fragile. Silence could prevent scandal, but it rarely healed the tensions that created the silence in the first place. Within many noble families, the arrangement that allowed the husband, the mistress, and the distant wife to coexist without open conflict created a strange atmosphere inside the household. Everyone understood the situation, yet no one spoke about it directly. The truth lived quietly between conversations. Servants sensed it in the careful tone used when mentioning certain names. Guests felt it in the way discussions avoided particular subjects during dinners. Even laughter during gatherings sometimes carried a cautious edge, as though everyone understood that certain realities should remain unspoken. For the husband, the arrangement protected reputation. He continued to appear honourable, maintaining a stable household that avoided the public chaos of divorce or scandal. His alliances remained secure, and his social standing remained intact. Yet even he could not entirely escape the tension created by the silence surrounding his personal life. The mistress, too, occupied an uncertain place within this quiet arrangement. Though she might now share the master's attention and influence within the household, she still lacked the legal recognition that defined legitimate authority in Tudor society. Her position depended entirely on continued favour. She might enjoy the warmth of companionship and the attention of the household, yet she understood that her place rested on circumstances rather than law. The stability she experienced could vanish as easily as it had appeared. The wife, meanwhile, lived with a different kind of uncertainty. Though she retained her title and dignity, the emotional structure of her family had already shifted away from her. The marriage remained intact in the eyes of society. Yet the private reality of that union had become something far more complicated. For her, silence required endurance. Speaking openly about the situation might risk humiliation or public scandal. Remaining silent preserved dignity. Yet it also meant living within a structure that no longer offered the closeness once expected from marriage. The emotional cost of this arrangement extended beyond the adults involved. Children raised inside such households grew up surrounded by contradictions. They were taught to respect their parents, honor family tradition, and maintain loyalty to the household name. Yet the daily life unfolding around them quietly challenged those lessons. They saw affection directed towards someone outside the lawful marriage. They noticed the absence of warmth between parents who still shared the same title and home. They sensed the careful avoidance that shaped conversations within the household. Children often understood more than adults assumed. Even when no one explained the situation openly, the atmosphere itself revealed the truth. A son might observe how his father divided attention between different figures in the house. A daughter might notice the quiet sadness in her mother's behavior when certain topics arose. These observations shaped how the next generation understood family life. Trust could become complicated when loyalty appeared divided. Children might struggle to reconcile the dignity of their mother's title with the reality that her influence within the household had diminished. The silence protecting the family's reputation also prevented honest conversation that might have helped them understand what they were witnessing. Over time, this environment created a subtle instability within the family. The household continued functioning smoothly on the surface. Meals were served. Celebrations took place. And alliances with other families remained intact. Yet the emotional structure holding the family together had quietly weakened. Each member lived within a version of the truth that could not be fully acknowledged. The husband protected his reputation. The mistress guarded her fragile position. The wife maintained her dignity through restraint. Children learned to navigate the unspoken boundaries surrounding all of them. To outsiders, the family still represented stability. But stability built on silence often hides fractures that cannot easily be repaired. Tudor society valued honor and reputation so strongly that preserving appearances sometimes mattered more than addressing the emotional consequences of private conflicts. Noble families protected their names through careful discipline. Yet the people living inside those households often carried the weight of that discipline in ways history rarely recorded. The silent agreement that allowed everyone to avoid scandal came with its own hidden cost. Not every wound becomes visible. Some simply remain beneath the surface, shaping the lives of those who live with them. The silent agreement preserved the dignity and reputation of the household. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the family lived with tensions that no one openly acknowledged. When silence protects honor but hides truth, the cost is often carried quietly by every generation inside the house. The story of many Tudor marriages did not end with a dramatic scandal or public collapse. Histories often remember the loud moments of the past. Executions, betrayals, wars, and royal decrees. Yet within the quiet walls of noble houses, another kind of change often unfolded, one that left far fewer traces in official records. Power did not always move through confrontation. It could shift slowly, almost gently, carried by patience rather than force. In many households, the wife never lost her title, never faced open accusation, and never experienced a public disgrace. From the outside, her life remained respectable. Her name still appeared beside her husband's in family documents. Her place within the lineage of the estate remained intact. Yet the real centre of influence inside the household had already moved elsewhere. Visitors entering the manor might still see her seated at the long dining table during formal occasions. Servants still addressed her with the titles required by custom. The household itself continued functioning with the same outward discipline expected from a noble family. Nothing looked broken, but something essential had quietly disappeared. The conversations shaping the family's future happened in different rooms now. Decisions that once passed through her voice moved along other paths. The attention that had once surrounded her presence gradually gathered around someone else. No confrontation marked the moment when this shift became permanent. Instead, it happened through a long sequence of small adjustments. Conversations redirected. Invitations quietly altered. Loyalties slowly repositioned. Each change seemed minor when viewed alone. Together, they reshaped the life of the household. In Tudor society, reputation often mattered more than honesty. Families protected their dignity by avoiding open conflict. Even when private relationships had already fractured, silence allowed the household to appear stable, and stability protected alliances with other powerful families. As long as the scandal remained absent, the arrangement could continue. The husband preserved the image of a calm and honourable man. The mistress gained influence without openly challenging the structure of marriage. The wife retained her title and avoided the humiliation that might accompany public accusation. Each person maintained a role within the delicate balance. Yet the emotional reality beneath that balance remained complicated. The wife lived within a household that no longer revolved around her presence. She watched decisions unfold from a distance she could not easily cross. Her dignity remained intact, but dignity alone could not restore the influence that had quietly moved elsewhere. Over time, this quiet disappearance became part of the ordinary life of many noble families. Historians often overlook such endings because they leave so little evidence behind. There are no dramatic letters filled with accusations, no trials recorded in church courts, no violent confrontations preserved in chronicles. What remains instead are faint traces: a wife who begins living more frequently at a distant estate, a companion who appears more often beside the master of the house during gatherings, children who grow accustomed to a household shaped by unspoken arrangements. From the outside, nothing seems extraordinary. Yet within the private world of the family, everything has changed. Power in Tudor households often moved through patience rather than force. Those who understood this quiet rhythm could reshape the structure of a family without ever declaring their intentions openly. Influence drifted. Attention shifted. Loyalties rearranged themselves with careful restraint. By the time anyone recognized what had happened, the transformation had already been completed. The wife had not been defeated in battle. She had simply been left standing outside the center of the household's life. For many women in Tudor history, this kind of ending remained invisible to the world beyond the manor gates. Their names survived in family records, but the quiet erosion of their influence rarely appeared in the stories told by chroniclers. Yet those silent changes shaped the emotional landscape of noble families across generations. They revealed how power could operate without violence, how authority could shift without announcement, and how dignity could coexist with a deep sense of isolation. The disappearance of a wife within her own household was not always a tragedy marked by scandal. Sometimes it was something far quieter, something that unfolded so gradually that no single moment could be blamed for it. And that quiet transformation might be the most unsettling detail of all. Power does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it simply waits. Waits until the structure around it adjusts, until attention moves in a new direction, until the person who once stood at the center finds herself standing slightly apart from the life she once guided. In Tudor England, many such stories unfolded without leaving clear records. Yet, the silence surrounding them speaks loudly enough. Power does not always need conflict to win. Sometimes it advances through patience, hors distance, and quiet rearrangements that no one openly challenges. Tudor history contains many wives who did not fall through scandal, but slowly faded from the center of their own households. Thank you for listening to this quiet journey through the hidden dynamics of Tudor family life. These stories remind us that history is not only shaped by kings, battles, and public events, but also by the silent negotiations that unfold within ordinary households. If you have followed this story from beginning to end, you have witnessed how influence can shift without noise, how reputation can mask private realities, and how patience can become one of the most powerful forces in human relationships. Now the house grows quiet again. The corridors of the manor settle into silence. The candles burn low, and the voices that once filled these rooms slowly fade into the distance of history. Perhaps it is time to let the past rest. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow the calm of the night to carry these stories away. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful.